Hi, everyone. There we go. It's great to be here. So, bicho, bug in Spanish, that was the first ever word I pronounced. At 1.5 years of age, it wasn't mom or dad. I swear this was my first word in Argentina as a toddler. And I never once changed my mind. I was so passionate about the natural world, even though I was a city kid, but I had very, very encouraging parents. So when I was 19 years old, I found out that the Canadian International Development Agency was funding students from developing countries to come to Canada and do their degrees. And I applied for one of these scholarships and got it, and my life entirely changed when I stepped on that plane. And from my very first minute in Canada, I started writing people all over the world to try and secure myself positions for the summers. So I would study during the year, and in the summers I would either volunteer or do an internship or get paid a little bit for a research assistantship. But I wanted to be out there working with social animals. That was my fascination. So I worked with coyotes in Yellowstone National Park for my undergrad thesis, and worked on the humpback whale disentanglement program in Newfoundland back in the early 90s, believe it or not. I followed a troop of baboons in Africa, in the Kenyan savannah, for hours on end, and this is not as romantic as it sounds. And for my master's, I had the fortune to have an incredibly creative and forward-thinking advisor that was a frog biologist, and he knew that I didn't want to have anything to do with something not mammalian. I was interested in mammal social behavior and communication. And so he said, you don't need to study frogs, just do a master's for me, pick an animal. I said, red foxes, and he said, okay, go find them. So at first I spent hours perched on a tree in the winter with meat 100 meters from me, and my grand idea was that a fox would come, eat the meat, and lead me to its den. The terrible idea, and Tess, I know, not the right thing to do. So that didn't work. So I put an ad in the newspapers of the area. And this is the milder of the ads. The first ad, and I looked online the other day because I really wanted to have that ad up here on my talk, but this was before the era of internet. But the first ad read, are you a farmer? Do you have foxes on your backyard? Stop! Don't shoot! Call me instead. And I got so many phone calls. People wanted to tell me their stories. They wanted to tell me they had shared this den for years and years in front of their kitchen or by their barn. And so I went and visited with these farmers, and I picked 8 different den sites, and I looked at how females and males differ in raising the young in monogamous pairs of foxes. That was my master's, so nothing to do with marine mammals. But marine mammals were in my blood. This is my grandmother in the 1950s. Again, Tess, I know you're going, oh my God, this is exactly what you should not do. She was probably participating in an ad of what not to do with marine mammals, and I don't know it yet. But yeah, she's cutting off she's in between the sea lion colony and the sea lion. This is not what you do. But this was my grandmother, and as her, I was fascinated by marine mammals, especially by cetaceans, because of their profound communicative abilities. So when I was going through the talk, I actually entertained the notion of skipping this part because I didn't know if I would get all choked up. And very soon I realized that it is impossible to tell my story without this part. These animals contributed so much to the story I'm going to tell you. And it started with a phone call to Lance Barrett-Leonard, who was and continues to be the head of the Cetacean Research Lab and a great killer whale biologist. And I wanted to study killer whale communication like everybody else in the world. So he said, no, we have too many people, we can't do that. But if you're interested, there's a calf that's about to be born at the aquarium. Do you want to come study how it develops its sounds? And I thought, what an amazing opportunity. Belugas they've been named the sea canaries for a very long time, back when at the beginning of the century, when whalers would hear their sounds through the hull of their boats. That is how vocal they are. And so now I want you all to close your eyes and imagine you live in a world of sound. Vision plays no role here. So the creaking noises, that's echolocation. The remaining sounds are communication sounds. So extremely, extremely vocal, and yet up until very recently we knew absolutely nothing about the way these whales learn all of these sounds and about what these sounds mean. So the first thing to do when you want to understand an animal's repertoire and how they develop this repertoire is figure out what that repertoire is. So I spent many, many hours watching 5 different adults at the Vancouver Aquarium for a number of years, actually, and trying to put together a repertoire of the sounds that were the easiest to identify and that correlated well with behavioral states, such as playing or aggression or relaxation. And these are some. I'm not going to play all 28, but these are some of them. Usually I read the names, but I can't, I don't have my glasses, so I trust you can read the names. That's what I call the sneeze. That's an above water call that the whales use to communicate with their trainers, with whom they have amazing relationships, and they make this sound on the surface very often. That is a play sound. That's play. This is what you get to learn. Watching belugas is like watching aliens. You don't know anything about their repertoire. So slowly you start putting it together, and it was really cool to figure out that that's the sound they make when they are engaging in playful interactions. That, believe it or not, is aggression. That is a chase. That's the sound they make when they chase each other. And that is the famous contact call that is now at the center of my studies and has been at the center of my studies since then. A challenge when you study cetaceans is that they don't make sounds through their mouths. They make sounds through their noses, essentially. They produce sounds with a set of structures called the monkey lips that are below their blowhole. Sound travels over 4 times faster in water than in air. So if you're sitting there watching a bunch of animals and you hear sounds, you don't know where the sound is coming from, and you have no indication from these animals that they're making a sound. And to study communication, you need to understand who the receiver is and who the sender of the sound is. And so how do you do this? Thankfully, for studying vocal development, this becomes a little easier because calves don't learn until they are much older to close their blowholes properly when they speak. And so they leave a trail of bubbles behind with every vocalization. And so by looking at that trail of bubbles, you can figure out who vocalizes. So I recorded a tuvok for about a year. And I found that much like humans babble and there's a sub-song in birds, belugas also babble. They're not born at all knowing this incredible repertoire of sounds. They very slowly learn it. They learn it from the animals that they share their social group with, in particular their mom. And it takes about a year to develop the contact call, the maternal contact call with perfection. And this is an example of a vocal exchange. You will hear initially the calf, and you will see how different he sounds from the adult contact calls, the fully developed calls. That's the calf. That's an adult. Calf, adult. So the calves sound like as if you were rubbing your finger through a comb. And the problem with this is that these sounds are harder to hear, and this has implications for conservation. And I'm going to talk about noise in the ocean in just a couple of minutes. The first thing for me, after I finished my study, was to figure out if the sounds that I had found, the contact calls that play such a key biological function, could be found in the wild. And I thought, where can I do this? Well, DFO biologists occasionally go out and temporarily restrain belugas to feed them with satellite tags. And I thought, what a perfect opportunity. I bet you they make contact calls. So I pestered these scientists to tag along with them on one of their trips, and they took me along. We spent a month on a little island on the Nelson River estuary in Hudson Bay. And indeed, I found that the calls that these whales produced when trying to maintain contact with the rest of their group, they were temporarily restrained for about 10 to 20 minutes, were contact calls. And then I partnered up with a long time now research colleague, the president of GREM, which is a non-for-profit in Quebec that studies whales. And he gave me hours and hours and hours of recordings from, he had been studying whales in the St. Lawrence for 30 years. So that's probably familiar. It was so loud. Probably familiar to you by now. You could all probably identify it as a contact call. I did too. At the time, Robert was an invited scientist at the aquarium, so I ran into his office and I said, I found contact calls. Do you have the behavioral data for this? And he looked, and it was a mother beluga calling and calling after her dead calf. So we knew beyond a doubt that these contact calls exist in wild populations. So keep that notion for a second. The study of cetacean communication is completely entangled with the issue of noise in the oceans, which is omnipresent. And noise essentially is a sound that you don't want. And you probably all experienced at one time or another noise, unwanted sounds that you can't bear. And there is little doubt that noise pollution is a hazard for our health. It doesn't let us sleep. It interferes with our communication. There have been hundreds, thousands of newspaper articles from all over the world stating that noise is a problem for us. And if noise is a problem for humans, imagine what noise does to animals that rely on sound for pretty much every aspect of their lives. It can be deadly. Beaked whales and pilot whales and sperm whales have all stranded, presumably from noise-related causes. Military sonar and seismic air guns are potential culprits. They essentially both emit very, very loud pulses of sound, military sonar at mid and high frequencies, and seismic air guns at lower frequencies, and it causes the whales to panic and to go up to the surface too quickly from their dives, and it causes divers' bends, essentially. So marine mammals can also get decompression sickness, and affecting their tissues and including their ear canals. So this is a tragedy. And in addition to these extreme things, we have shipping, worldwide shipping and recreational boating, and the level of underwater noise has increased tremendously in the past 50 years in our oceans. Water transmits sound much more efficiently than air. And this chronic exposure to noise can really affect the lives of cetaceans in many ways. In addition, the Arctic is melting, and this exacerbates the problem of noise because you essentially get more access. This map is showing that the white areas is older, thicker ice. The blue areas, those show newer, thinner ice. So the Arctic ice is not only being reduced in size, in expand, but it's also thinner and newer ice. And this is entirely changing the way marine mammals are interacting with their Arctic soundscape because there is more access. And I want to illustrate this. So this is the second time I'm going to make you close your eyes. Close your eyes and imagine a quiet soundscape. This is the St. Lawrence River estuary. And 2 hours later, boats started filling up the area and surrounding our research boat and our hydrophone and the whales that we were recording. And this is the last time I'm going to make you close your eyes, just to imagine what it is like to try to communicate across that noise barrier. So it's a really dire problem. You could probably hear some of the whistles and communication calls, but imagine the energy you would have to spend as a whale that is swimming around entirely turbid waters where you can't, if one of your companions swims away and is probably, I don't know, 2, 3, 4 meters away, you can barely see them. You really rely on sound, and imagine having to fight through waves and waves of that. But there is a beautiful area on the north end of Somerset Island, on the high Arctic. I had the fortune to spend 2 seasons there, 2014 and 2015, where whales from the Baffin Bay high Arctic population bring in their calves and spend about 3 weeks every summer. And there's absolutely no underwater noise other than natural ambient noise. So it was the perfect opportunity to continue to understand the function of contact calls. This is a beluga nursery, after all. What a perfect place to understand how mothers and calves communicate in the absence of noise, and then take this information to noisier areas to compare and to figure out how communication is affected and how communication changes. And why am I so fascinated by contact calls? Because when you know nothing about a species' repertoire, you need to focus on something that has a known function, and it is better if you focus on something that has a very important biological function. So we have identified contact calls for pretty much every social species of bird whose vocalizations we have studied, every social species of terrestrial mammal whose vocalizations we have studied, and every social species of marine mammals. So belugas are just one more marine mammal with these contact calls being so important. And I wanted to illustrate the importance of contact calls. I recruited my daughter. At the time she was 9 years old, and the idea came to me at a playground. I thought, geez, this really sounds like a beluga nursery. We're just like belugas. And I said, why don't you go to the other side of the playground and call me? I'm going to be here with my iPhone. So people didn't know what was going on. It was a busy Sunday, and here I am with my iPhone telling my daughter to call me, and this is what you could hear. So you probably all noticed that the sounds, what happened there? They sounded the same, repeated, emphatic, got longer at the end with a little bit more urgency, but it never changed. The mummy is the mummy, and they're stereotyped, and you can pick them out of a species chatter, of the background chatter of the species. If I play the next clip, which is not a great clip, but I think it'll do, I bet you all with little experience on contact calls, you will all be able to tell which ones the beluga contact calls are in this clip. So they're very broadband. This means, and I forgot to tell you when I showed the spectrograms, that when we study sounds, we look at sounds. It's interesting. We're such a visual species that to study sounds, we need to look at them. And spectrograms show on the y-axis the frequency of these sounds, or the number of vibrations per second. And the contact calls are very interesting because they're very broadband. This means they cover a very, very wide range of frequencies. So 2014, this was my first time in the Arctic. I was dropped off in that little yurt, and the lady that dropped me off took off on her ATV to the nearby lodge, which was where I had to hike for all my meals. And I sat there with my backpack, my hydrophone, on a little cot going, my God, what have I done? I was terrified. But I got used to the area, and the ice did recede. So I would observe the whales from shore and from a tower. This is how I, just illustrating how I laid out the hydrophone from shore. And this is from the tower, and the trick with the research tower was to remember to exit the tower before high tide, or else you get stuck there for 8 hours. This is an example. I hope you can see the little research tower, and this is at mid-tide. So slowly the whales surround the tower, and the water surrounds the tower. And if you're sitting on that tower, and this is happening, you forget to exit the tower because you're just so utterly fascinated by your surroundings. So I got stuck on that tower with little food and no water, and it was very cold. So I only did it once. And I learned to exit in a timely manner. You also, when you're in the field, nothing is ever like you plan it. You plan a field season, and then you scrap the planning, and you carry out your field season, which is nothing like you've planned for. So I never would have imagined that the world would have set up the perfect natural experiment for me, where groups of whales would depart from the larger aggregation and get entrapped in these little river canals. The tide would go down, the sand would act as sound barriers, and so I knew that I was recording that group and only that group, which is much better than recording 500 whales at once and not knowing what's going on. And this happened 14 times. So predictably, over 50% of the calls that the whales produced in these entrapments were contact calls. Of course, because they are in a different situation, in a different scenario. They might be trying to get in touch with the members of the herd on the other side or with each other. The fact is, contact calls make up about 5 to 10% of the natural repertoire on a regular day on the Delta, but here it was 50%, so great opportunity to study these contact calls. And we had opportunistic access to a drone. And with a drone, you can look in and you can see the group composition. And I can't, for the life of me, read the text here, so I don't know what the group composition was. There's some juveniles and some calves, if the text is still there. But the important thing is that we could determine the number of young animals in a group and whether the group had babies. And this is key to correlate with the sounds that the group is making. If I didn't have access to a drone, this was my homemade drone with a GoPro on top of a pole. It didn't work that well, but it worked. And the initial best finding, this is from my very first recording in Cunningham Inlet, was that contact calls are not just broadband, they are incredibly broadband. They reach frequencies of up to 125 kilohertz. Our best hearing is about 20 kilohertz. Imagine, if you could hear information all the way to 125 kilohertz. This is one of the reasons we cannot study these sounds without looking at them, because we can't hear, and at my age, I can't hear anything past 14 kilohertz. So you need to look at these sounds. I'm not sure. Do you guys see words there? Oh, interesting. Okay, so there's supposed to be some words there saying something like 15,000 calls analyzed thus far and counting. My research assistant, Mariana, who's here in the audience today, and I have been looking at these sounds for the better part of a year and a half, and really getting to understand what these contact calls are all about, because you can, with the little natural experiment we had, you can do things like do groups that have little calves in them sound very different than groups that don't? This has conservation implications. You can look at things like, do they have signature calls? Do they have calls that identify them as individuals, like we have names? And we're finding out really, really cool stuff. And more about this on my next talk. We're in the process. You also take advantage of opportunities like strandings. This was a stranding with a happy ending, so don't worry. But again, I figured they would make contact calls in these circumstances, and they did. This is, I just loved standing there with these whales. You can see the adult wrapping her tail around the calf. She did this every time the calf was agitated. It showed such degree of empathy. It was one of my favorite moments. Also watching the whiter of the adults try and push the companion towards deeper water. It was beautiful to watch. And fast forward a year, and we have the St. Lawrence estuary population, where you have isolated, it's an isolated population. It is declining. It's just been declared formally endangered. You have no more than about 850 animals or so, and calves are dying at unprecedented rates. We know for some of the years what the problem was. We think that, scientists think that it's a toxic algae bloom in 2008. It could be disturbance, it could be the shifting ice patterns and a change in prey availability. We don't know. But with my colleagues at GREM, again, Robert Michaud, who studied contact calls with me in the earlier years, and I think this is missing the words again, but the title is Mom, Can You Hear Me? We're looking at whether the calls that calves make are being masked by anthropogenic noise. The St. Lawrence is a very busy place. And this is one of my most beautiful moments in my career, was to get to bring my daughter to the field for the first time. That was fantastic. Again, we used a drone to locate the whales and to determine how many boats and what types of boats, potentially, which would indicate potentially the kinds of noise they would be making, were around the whales. And oh yeah, this is the right slide. Also to identify little groups with calves and be sure to basically target those groups for the recordings, and to look at mother-calf separations. And this is the St. Lawrence. You can see the dark water. It's such a turbid place. If you're on a boat, very often you can't see the details of behavior. It was very difficult to do this with a drone too, but very slowly we're collecting the data we want, such as how often mothers and calves separate. Do they stick together when they are traversing areas of noise? Do they avoid separation? Do they separate and then cannot regain contact? What happens there with noise and in areas of the St. Lawrence that do not have noise? And this is an example. It's not very loud. You can see the little calf sort of splitting away from the group, and then the adults slowly orienting towards the calf, so a very clear separation. There were a couple of contact calls. Now, this is the kind of data we're looking for, and it is extremely difficult to get, because very often we don't know if the group that we're recording is the group that we're droning. But occasionally it happens that we know that we have a very nearby group and everyone else is either not there or very far away, and so we take these opportunities that are few and far between to accumulate the data we want. And I will end this talk with my favorite video of last season, which was actually a group of males. I love that call. This was a group of 15 males. Some of them were known males because our research partners have been photo-identifying these guys for 30 years. And it's important to record groups that do not have any calves in them as a control situation. You know, what kinds of sounds are predominant when you don't have little calves in a group. We also learned so much. This is just a 2-minute clip, but these males were engaging with each other in such a beautiful tactile and social way. And so this is essentially it. I'm really looking forward to another season in the St. Lawrence. I've said this many times in the past, but I'll say it again because I really believe it, that when we're studying a species, the more you follow the story, the deeper into the novel you get, and you do not know the ending, and the more curious you become. So I can't wait to turn the next page of this novel next year. Thank you.
Let's ask Valeria some good questions and get some conversation going. I have one for you. As I was listening to the sounds, which are amazing, thank you so much for sharing them with us. I've never heard that much whale sound before. Have you ever taken any of those recordings and like played them to whales to see what would happen? Like can you trick whales?
It's a great question. Yes, I have.
Oh, of course.
That was our first little excursion to the St. Lawrence in 2008, this totally failed study where the grand idea was to play contact calls to the whales and expect them to answer back. And we wanted to understand stuff about vocal matching and whether they would reply to the contact call of their own community. There's female communities in the St. Lawrence that are separated. And so we recorded contact call. We had Robert Michaud, that was my research partner, had been recording these guys for many years. So he had recordings from each community. So we only played contact calls to the community that the contact calls belonged to. The answer, a deep and profound silence. We never got more than silence. And, you know, if you think about it, you're playing sounds that are not true replicates because we didn't have the ability at the time to to broadcast broadband sounds at the frequencies that they can hear. So it's as if you were playing clipped sounds. Also, the sounds mean something to these whales. They might even mean names if you're playing around with contact calls. So it is as if you were in a room chatting with 10 people, you know the 10 people, you know Carla is right there, and then you hear from far away a really distorted version of Carla. You're like, no, Carla is here. I don't believe that, and I'm not going to answer. So, yeah, okay. That didn't work.
Thanks so much for your talk. Absolutely amazing, amazing work you've done. Like, good. Unbelievable. I'm so blown away. A couple of questions. One is, did you ever find that, you know, you've been to the St. Lawrence and over here and up north, did you see that they had almost like different accents for different regions?
Oh, that's $1 million question, and we want to explore that. And it's coming. You know, we first need to understand if they have different names, and we need to understand the function of their calls. And then we need to understand if they pronounce those calls with different accents. If you try and investigate accents without knowing anything about the sounds they make, you may be comparing apples and oranges. Yeah. So that it's little by its baby steps, but yeah, it's a good question.
And then my part two is, has the government of Canada or Environmental Canada or whoever we have to have this conversation with, have they considered making beluga highways, like actual sections of waterways that are completely exclusive to animals that no boats whatsoever of any kind
absolutely
can go into? Like, why can't we research, like, why can't we do this?
Yes, we can, and we should, and anybody right now that is concerned about cetaceans and underwater noise is advocating for that. And in the St. Lawrence, that it is a particularly vulnerable and endangered population, there are certainly discussions underway to create those kinds of area. That's the solution, protected areas where no access is allowed. Yeah.
Yes. So many questions, Valeria. Thank you.
Yeah.
Can you describe the connection between field-based research and aquarium-based research? Can one exist without the other?
It depends on the kinds of questions that you ask. I'm not going to say that there's population biology level questions that you can answer at an aquarium, but there are questions that you cannot answer in the wild. Up until very recently, it would have been impossible to test belugas' hearing in the wild, for example. We did that at different aquaria around the world. Christine Urbis' earlier studies she was the first person that understood the potentially damaging effects of masking, of noise masking from icebreakers on belugas. She conducted those studies in a captive situation. You could never conduct those experimental studies in the wild. So however you might feel about captivity, there are certainly some studies that you just would not be able to conduct in the wild, and vice versa. There's some studies in the wild that you can't conduct in captivity. To follow the vocal development of a beluga calf, impossible in the wild. You just can't. There's 300 whales vocalizing at once. You can, if you're lucky, you can identify big groups with and with no calves. But to follow the development stage by stage of the repertoire of an animal, and to understand that the first sound they make plays a really important biological function, that's something that it will probably be fairly hard to do in the wild. Yeah.
Thank you. That was a wonderful speech, or talk. Again, I have like a whole pile of questions, but I guess one. It appears that there's been a lot more research, for instance, on, say, the vocalizations of, say, the southern resident orca population and things. How has that informed your beluga research? And then my other little quick question was, I read somewhere about acidification in the ocean affecting on humpback communications. I believe acidification, what makes the ocean kind of the sound travel farther, so that masking sound. I don't know if you have any information on that, because I wasn't quite clear what I read on that subject.
Okay, I can't comment too much on the humpback business. I definitely can tell you that the composition of the water, the degree of salinity, for example, changes the way, how far the sounds will transmit. So I'm not surprised. And in terms of whether other studies, not just killer whales, but dolphins, sperm whales, how they inform my work, it's constant. If you do not read about these other studies, you can't work. Knowing that groups of sperm whales have codas that they use and that are different than the codas from other groups of sperm whales, knowing that killer whales have repertoires and they have these dialects that they maintain even when there's no geographical barrier between populations. That informs my studies. Bottlenose dolphins, they have a fission-fusion society where animals come together for periods of time and then split off and join larger aggregations. That's very similar to what belugas do. And it's very important for an animal in an underwater world where, sound is the glue of their society and they inform one another of each other's presence with their name or their signature. That would be equally important for belugas. This is why Mariana and I are looking at whether they could possibly have signatures like bottlenose dolphins. Yeah.
God, this is fascinating, isn't it? Couldn't we talk for hours?
To kind of touch on the highway question, I was talking to my group about, I guess, the research you've been doing and realizing how the noise from the ships and everything are affecting them. Have you guys started looking into the mental health of the whales and how that's affecting them?
It's such a beautiful question and absolutely impossible to answer, and that's the trick with whales. Imagine, like up until drones, essentially, you had 5 behavioral categories when watching whales to determine their state of being. You would say milling, this is kind of wandering about slowly, or traveling unidirectionally or multidirectionally, resting. You don't see them well. With a drone, you can now look in and really pick up on a lot more details of their behavior. So I would imagine if there's indications of stress that are behavioral, you would start learning about those, but we haven't yet. So to understand the mental health of a whale, I don't know how you would do it.
Didn't I see a movie where we figured out how to speak whale? I'll be back to this corner. I'm sure I saw that movie. Or maybe it was Aliens. Yeah. Has anybody seen Arrival yet?
Okay, thank you for sharing your story with the grandmother. My question is, can this sound be used by big fish corporations or the military for misusing it, and can Greenpeace use it to divert the because there was a film about Japanese fishing where they managed to use sound to get so that they could catch all the fish.
Oh, okay. So are you asking if we can lure beluga with their own sounds?
Can whale sound be weaponized?
What's that?
Can whale sounds be weaponized against whale or, fish, or fishing or
I
consumed
don't.
or profit for profit? Yeah.
I don't know. I don't see how it. I mean, imagine the responses we got to our one failed study. You know, playing beluga sounds. They didn't like that much. I'm not sure what you could do.
If one day
with
we all
playbacks.
find out that she became really, really rich, we'll know.
I wish.
We are running out of time. I'm just gonna go with one more question. I'm real sorry. I'm gonna choose Todd. You always ask good questions. I have no idea who this is. I'm gonna go with her. Okay.
I feel like a lot of people in the room might be feeling like, oh my gosh, this is so amazing, but also really sad and disheartening. And my question is, as a researcher and with your extensive experience, what would you suggest for people who are wanting to engage more in this issue? What can we do to support this? What do you think is the best strategy?
I would say talk about it. Talk, you know, be aware. Pass the word. People don't talk enough about what's going on under the surface, under the oceans. Join. I don't know. Join associations that are working towards consolidating these marine protected areas or these little whale havens. We're not just talking about belugas, but about every single cetacean species that is in our oceans. The technology to be silent underwater is there. For example, submarines, military submarines are very stealthy and quiet. It's just very expensive. And so it's a matter of priorities. When it begins to be important enough to us, the money will hopefully start to be there to create quieter ships, quieter boats, quieter everything.
Is there this is a very generous tribe. Is there somewhere we can donate to the cause?
My God, Tess, do you know? Totally great question, and it catches me off guard.
I think financial donations are great.
Hi, I'm a colleague of Valeria's at the aquarium in the Marine Mammal Research Program. I think financial donations are great, but we really need to speak up and let our governments know how we feel about this. Legislation on this issue is really, I think, what's going to make the change. So be vocal, make phone calls, write letters, write emails.
Thank you, Tess. I knew she would do it for me.
That's what we need to do.
She's the person. This is why I brought her here. No.
You know,
Thanks,
this reminds me of. I would imagine most people in this room are well aware of the risks to our environment and ecosystem and marine environment with the coming of pipelines and all of the tanker traffic. And we talk about oil spill, oil spill, oil spill, oil spill. Sure. But what we just learned today is also that if we have 7 times more tankers off the coast in the Salish Sea and out there, holy we're going to have blind, lost whales wandering around because all they can hear is right?
It's
this is going to be a problem.
not good.
This is that's
not
the
good.
polite way to say it. It's not good.
Not good.
This is not good. You can beep that out, right? Okay. Thank you, my dear. Thank you very much.
Thank you for